The wind that swept across Delaware County in the biting autumn of 1938 did not care about a man's legacy, nor did it show mercy to the brittle bones of 78-year-old Liam Vance. It was a cruel, relentless season, the kind that whispered of endings, carrying the scent of dying leaves and frozen earth over thousands of acres of what used to be the most fertile soil in the state. For nearly 6 decades, this land had been Liam's pulse, his sweat, and his silent companion. He had built an empire out of dust, surviving the collapse of markets, the treachery of weather, and the slow, agonizing theft of time. But as he stood on the porch of his sprawling homestead, his calloused hands gripping the wooden railing until his knuckles turned as white as the frost on the grass, Liam was not thinking about the thousands of cattle he owned or the small fortune quietly resting in distant, secure bank vaults. He was thinking about a terrifying, unspoken truth that had begun to rot his spirit from the inside out. He was an old man, standing on the edge of eternity, surrounded by wealth but suffocated by an agonizing doubt. He looked out at the rolling hills, his vision slightly blurred by age, and felt a profound, aching emptiness that no amount of gold could ever fill. He knew his body was failing him, the sharp pains in his chest and the heavy fatigue in his limbs were daily reminders that the curtain was drawing to a close. Yet the physical pain was nothing compared to the phantom ache in his heart. Liam was a father to 3 grown children, Thomas, Eleanor, and Lucas. He had given them everything a father could possibly provide: elite educations in the prestigious institutions of the Northeast, lives of absolute comfort, and the security of a name that commanded respect wherever it was spoken. But in doing so, he began to wonder if he had accidentally traded their souls for material prosperity. In recent months, as his health declined, the visits from his children had taken on a different, unsettling tone. They no longer looked at him with the warmth of a child looking at a protector. Instead, their eyes lingered on the antique furniture, the deeds to the property, and the ledger books on his desk. Their conversations were laced with thinly veiled inquiries about his will, his assets, and his final arrangements. They were circling like vultures before the breath had even left his lungs, their affection feeling more like a calculated transaction than genuine love. The realization was a devastating blow, a betrayal that cut deeper than any knife. Liam realized that if he died tomorrow, he would leave behind a massive fortune, but he would never truly know if any of his children actually loved the man who had sacrificed his youth for them, or if they merely worshipped the wealth he was about to leave behind. The uncertainty was maddening, a dark cloud that threatened to eclipse the twilight of his life. He knew he could not pass into the great beyond carrying this heavy burden of doubt. He needed to know the truth, no matter how catastrophic, painful, or heartbreaking that truth might turn out to be. And so, on that bitter evening in 1938, as the shadows lengthened across the cold Delaware Valley, Liam made a desperate, terrifying decision. He would strip away the empire. He would cast down the walls of his wealth and present himself to his children not as a millionaire king, but as a broken, ruined, and completely destitute old man. It was a dangerous game, a psychological gamble that could shatter his family forever, but it was the only way to separate the gold from the dross, to see who would hold his hand when that hand had absolutely nothing left to offer. The plan required meticulous, flawless execution. Liam knew he had to construct a lie so airtight, so devastatingly convincing, that not even the sharpest legal or financial mind could detect the fabrication. He quietly traveled to the city, bypassing his usual high-profile lawyers, and met with an old, trusted friend from his youth, a retired attorney named Samuel, who swore himself to absolute secrecy. Together they forged legal documents, bank foreclosure notices, and official-looking letters detailing a catastrophic financial collapse. The narrative was simple, yet tragic. Liam had allegedly poured his entire life savings, along with the deeds to all his properties, into a massive, secret, speculative railroad venture in the West that had completely and utterly defaulted. According to the fake papers, every single cent was gone. The bank was moving in to seize the Delaware County homestead, and within a matter of weeks, Liam would be entirely homeless, penniless, and drowning in unpayable debt. To make the ruse complete, Liam began a physical transformation that broke his own heart to look at in the mirror. He stopped maintaining the pristine appearance that had always been his trademark. He allowed his clothes to become worn, frayed, and dusty. He stopped heating the grand rooms of the main house, restricting himself to a small, cold corner of the kitchen, eating meager portions of stale bread and thin broth. He let the fences rot, allowed the grand driveway to become overgrown with weeds, and dismissed the household staff, telling them privately that he was undertaking a private family matter, but paying them generously out of a hidden account to keep them away. When he looked at himself, he no longer saw the proud patriarch of Delaware County. He saw a ghost of a man, a shadow of poverty draped over an aging frame. The stage was set, the trap was laid, and the psychological crucible was about to begin. With a trembling hand, Liam sat down at his worn wooden table and wrote 3 identical letters, his handwriting intentionally shaky and desperate. He begged his children to return home immediately, stating that a disaster of unimaginable proportions had struck, and that their father desperately needed their help to survive. The first to arrive at the desolate, darkened estate was Thomas, the eldest son. Thomas was a highly successful investment banker in New York City, a man whose life was governed by profit margins, sharp suits, and an unyielding desire for social status. As his luxury automobile bounced heavily down the neglected, pothole-riddled driveway, Thomas's brow furrowed in deep annoyance. He stepped out of the car, careful not to get mud on his expensive leather shoes, and looked at the decaying state of his childhood home with a mixture of disgust and confusion. When he pushed open the heavy front door, there was no warmth, no roaring fire, and no staff to take his coat. Instead, he found his father sitting in the dim, freezing kitchen, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, shivering beside a cold stove. Liam looked up, his eyes hollow and welling with tears that were altogether too real. Born from the sheer terror of what he was about to discover, he reached out a frail, trembling hand toward his firstborn son. Thomas did not rush to embrace him. Instead, he stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning the room, landing instantly on the pile of forged foreclosure notices and legal demands that Liam had carefully scattered across the table. Before even asking his father how he was feeling, or why the house was freezing, Thomas snatched up the documents, his eyes darting across the lines of text with a frantic, predatory intensity. Liam watched him, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He spoke in a broken, raspy whisper, telling Thomas the fabricated story of the railroad collapse, weeping softly as he explained that everything was gone: the land, the money, the inheritance. He looked into his eldest son's eyes and pleaded, asking if he could come live with him in his grand New York townhouse, just for his remaining days, to have a warm bed and a corner to rest his weary head. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating and colder than the autumn wind outside. Thomas's face did not soften with sympathy or tighten with grief for his father's plight. Instead, it hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury and resentment. The veneer of filial devotion completely vanished, revealing the cold, calculating transaction that lay beneath. Thomas threw the papers back onto the table with a violent slap that echoed through the empty kitchen. He didn't look at his father with pity. He looked at him with an intense, burning anger, as if Liam had personally robbed him. He began to pace the floor, his voice rising in an aggressive, bitter tirade. He demanded to know how a man who had been so sharp could be so monumentally foolish, accusing Liam of ruining not just his own life, but the futures and social standing of his children. Thomas made it explicitly clear, without an ounce of hesitation, that there was absolutely no room for a bankrupt, disgraced old man in his high society New York life. He explained with a chillingly detached logic that his reputation in the banking world depended entirely on the perception of wealth and success, and that taking in a penniless, broken father would be a social and financial embarrassment he simply could not afford. He told Liam that he had his own family, his own elite circles to maintain, and that he could not waste his hard-earned resources on a man who had thrown away an empire on a foolish gamble. Liam sat perfectly still under his blanket, the tears drying on his withered cheeks, feeling a profound, icy numbness creeping into his soul. This was the boy he had taught to ride a horse, the son whose elite tuition he had paid without a second thought, the child he had stayed up with through feverish nights decades ago. And now that same son was looking at him as if he were nothing more than a piece of worthless, discarded garbage that was cluttering his path. Thomas did not offer a single dollar. He did not offer a word of comfort, and he certainly did not offer his home. Within an hour of his arrival, seeing that there was absolutely nothing left to inherit and no financial benefit to be gained from staying, Thomas packed his leather briefcase, turned his back on his father, and walked out into the gathering darkness, leaving the old man alone in the freezing, silent house. The departure of his eldest son left a wound in Liam's heart that he knew would never truly heal, but the crucible was far from over. The very next day, his daughter Eleanor arrived from Boston. Eleanor was a prominent socialite, married to a wealthy physician, a woman who moved in the most exclusive cultural circles and prided herself on her refinement, her charity galas, and her impeccable moral standing. When she walked into the house, her reaction to the decay was different from Thomas's, but no less revealing. She gasped, holding a silk handkerchief to her nose to shield herself from the dust and the dampness. When Liam, executing his heart-breaking role, stumbled toward her and broke down in tears, repeating the exact same devastating lie about the financial ruin and the imminent loss of the homestead, Eleanor did not comfort him. She immediately began to interrogate him, her voice sharp and frantic, wanting to know if any of her personal trusts, her jewelry or the family heirlooms, had been compromised in the crash. Liam, keeping his gaze lowered to hide the intense agony in his eyes, shook his head and confirmed that everything tied to the family estate was completely gone, leaving him with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and a mountain of debt. He looked at his daughter, his voice cracking with a desperate simulated vulnerability, and asked if there was a place for him in her large Boston mansion, perhaps in the guest cottage or a quiet room in the back, where he could simply live out his final months without being a burden. Eleanor's face contorted into an expression of profound distress, but it was not distress for her father's suffering. It was distress for her own comfort. She immediately began spinning a web of elaborate, superficial excuses, explaining that her home was constantly filled with high-profile guests, that her husband's medical practice required absolute quiet and decorum, and that they simply did not have the staff or the facilities to care for an elderly, destitute man with failing health. She suggested with a horrifyingly casual detachment that perhaps it would be best for Liam to look into a public asylum or a low-cost home for the indigent, promising that she would try to send a few dollars whenever her budget allowed, though she could make no firm commitments given the current economic climate. She kissed his cheek with a cold, superficial swiftness, a gesture that felt more like a Judas kiss than a daughter's affection, and left before the sun had even set, terrified that his poverty might somehow stain her pristine, curated life. Liam was left alone once again, the silence of the massive, empty house louder than a thunderstorm. 2 of his 3 children had been weighed in the balance and found completely wanting. They had looked at his vulnerability and seen only a liability. They had looked at his need and seen only an inconvenience. The pain was so intense that Liam genuinely wondered if his heart would fail him right then and there. He sat in the dark, watching the shadows lengthen across the floorboards, dreading the arrival of his youngest son, Lucas. Lucas had always been the black sheep of the family, the artist, the wanderer, the one who had rejected the high society expectations of his siblings to live a simple, modest life as a carpenter in a small town across the state line. Liam had often been hard on Lucas in the past, viewing his lack of financial ambition as a sign of weakness, frequently criticizing him for not using his education to amass power and wealth like Thomas and Eleanor. As Liam waited for Lucas to arrive, he felt a deep, suffocating wave of despair. If his 2 most successful, brilliant, and prosperous children had abandoned him without a second thought, what could he possibly expect from the son he had so often judged and dismissed? He braced himself for the final blow, fully expecting Lucas to either ignore the letter entirely or arrive only to cast judgment and gloat over the downfall of the strict patriarch who had never truly appreciated him. The suspense was agonizing, every tick of the old grandfather clock in the hallway sounding like a countdown to the absolute destruction of Liam's remaining hope. He felt completely naked, stripped of the armor of his wealth, waiting to see if his entire existence as a father had been a monumental, heartbreaking failure. When Lucas finally arrived, he did not come in a flashy, expensive automobile. He arrived on the evening bus, walking the final 3 miles from the town station to the homestead on foot. through the freezing rain, carrying nothing but a small canvas duffel bag. When he pushed open the front door, he didn't check the furniture or look for legal documents. He saw his father sitting in the cold, dark kitchen, huddled over the empty stove, and Lucas immediately dropped his bag to the floor with a heavy thud. He didn't hesitate for a single second. He rushed across the room, fell to his knees in front of the old man's chair, and threw his strong, calloused arms around his father's frail shoulders. Lucas didn't ask about the money, he didn't ask about the land, and he didn't ask about the inheritance. He simply held his father tight, his own voice thick with emotion as he whispered, "Dad, you're freezing. What happened? Are you hurt?" Liam, completely overwhelmed by the sudden, genuine warmth of the embrace, felt a dam break inside his chest. The tears that flowed from his eyes were no longer part of the act. They were the pure, unadulterated release of a soul that had been wandering in a desert of deceit. Through his simulated tears, Liam repeated the heartbreaking lie for the third and final time, showing Lucas the forged foreclosure notices and explaining that he was completely ruined, that the bank was taking everything, and that he was facing the terrifying prospect of dying a penniless beggar. Lucas listened quietly, his face serious and focused, but there was no anger in his eyes, no resentment, and no panic. He didn't look at the papers with disgust. He looked at his father with an intense, fierce protectiveness that Liam had never seen in any of his children before. Lucas stood up, his jaw set with a quiet, powerful determination. He didn't waste a single moment criticizing his father's alleged financial mistakes or bemoaning the loss of his own potential inheritance. Instead, he immediately went to work. He went out to the old woodpile in the freezing rain, gathered an armful of logs, and within minutes he had a roaring, crackling fire going in the kitchen hearth, bringing warmth back into the dead house for the first time in weeks. He searched the sparse pantry, found what little food was left, and prepared a simple, warm meal, gently encouraging his father to eat. As they sat by the fire, Lucas took his father's rough, trembling hands into his own and looked deep into his eyes. He told Liam with absolute certainty and a gentle smile that everything was going to be all right. He explained that wealth was just wood and stone, things that could be built up and torn down, but that family was permanent. Lucas told his father that he had a small, modest two-room cottage near his carpentry shop, and while it wasn't a grand estate like the Delaware County homestead, it was warm, it was safe, and it was filled with love. He told Liam that he was moving his father out of this cold house immediately, that Liam would live with him for the rest of his days, and that Lucas would work double shifts at the carpentry shop to pay off whatever debts he could and ensure his father never wanted for food, medical care, or comfort. He looked at Liam and said, "Dad, you spent your whole life building a future for us. You don't owe anyone anything anymore. It's my turn to take care of you." In that incredibly profound, emotionally overwhelming moment, Liam felt an immense weight lift from his spirit. The suspense, the terror, and the dark doubt that had plagued his mind for months dissolved into nothingness, replaced by a radiant, blinding clarity. He had found his answer. He had discovered the true gold in his life, and it wasn't hidden in a bank vault or buried in the fertile soil of his property. It was standing right in front of him, wrapped in the humble, unpretentious spirit of the son he had so grievously undervalued. The emotional payoff of Liam's grand, agonizing experiment had arrived, but the story was not yet complete. The old man knew that the truth had to be fully revealed, and that a profound, undeniable justice had to be served. Liam agreed to go with Lucas, allowing his youngest son to pack his few threadbare belongings and lead him away from the darkened estate. For the next 2 weeks, Liam lived in Lucas's tiny, modest cottage. He watched in silent, deeply moved awe as Lucas woke up before dawn every single morning, working long, grueling hours in the freezing cold at the carpentry shop, coming home exhausted but always maintaining a bright smile, a warm meal, and an endless supply of patience and love for his elderly father. Lucas never once complained about the financial burden, never once brought up the lost fortune, and treated his father with the absolute highest level of dignity, respect, and tenderness. Liam's health actually began to improve, not because of medicine, but because his soul was finally at peace, anchored by the profound knowledge that he was truly, unconditionally loved for exactly who he was, not for what he possessed. But as the 3rd week approached, Liam knew it was time to bring the curtain down on the Grand Theater. He secretly contacted Samuel, his trusted attorney friend, and instructed him to send an official legal summons to Thomas and Eleanor, commanding them to appear at the Delaware County homestead for a mandatory emergency legal meeting regarding their father's final estate and the resolution of his outstanding liabilities. The siblings, believing that there might still be some scraps of property or hidden assets left to salvage from the wreckage, or perhaps wanting to ensure they were legally protected from their father's debts, eagerly agreed to attend, completely unaware of the monumental revelation that awaited them. On a crisp, clear winter morning, the grand estate of Delaware County looked remarkably different. The fires were roaring in every single hearth, sending thick, welcoming plumes of white smoke into the sky. The driveway had been cleared, the grand front doors were unlocked, and the house was filled with an imposing, majestic stillness. Thomas and Eleanor arrived almost simultaneously, stepping into the grand dining room with expressions of confusion and lingering disdain, expecting to find a depressing legal foreclosure proceeding. Instead, they found a massive oak table, elegantly set, with Samuel the attorney sitting at the head, holding a thick, leather-bound folder. Lucas arrived moments later, walking gently beside his father, holding Liam's arm to support his steady, confident stride. Liam was no longer wearing the frayed, dusty clothes of a beggar. He was dressed in his finest, most immaculate tailored suit, his silver hair neatly combed, his posture straight, and his eyes burning with a fierce, unmistakable intelligence and authority that his elder children had not seen in years. Thomas and Eleanor gasped, stepping back in absolute shock as they looked at their father, realizing instantly that they had been completely and utterly deceived. The silence in the room was deafening, heavy with a suffocating tension, as Liam slowly walked to the head of the table, looked directly into the eyes of his 2 eldest children, and began to speak in a voice that was no longer a raspy whisper, but a powerful, resonant roar that commanded absolute attention. Liam explained with a calm, chilling precision the entire reality of the psychological test he had conducted. He told them how their constant inquiries about his wealth had poisoned his final years with doubt, and how he had constructed the elaborate illusion of his bankruptcy to see what lay hidden in the deep recesses of their hearts. He turned his gaze toward Thomas, his voice cutting through the air like ice, reminding him of his brutal words in the kitchen, his refusal to offer a single shred of comfort, and his absolute abandonment of his own father for the sake of social vanity. He then turned his eyes to Eleanor, recounting her superficial excuses, her obsession with her own status, and her horrifying suggestion to throw her own father into a public asylum rather than mar her pristine, curated life. Thomas and Eleanor turned pale, their faces contorting with a sudden, desperate panic as they realized the astronomical magnitude of what they had thrown away. They immediately began to stammer out frantic, hollow apologies, fabricating elaborate excuses, weeping and pleading with their father, claiming they had simply been overwhelmed, stressed, and that they had intended to help him all along. But Liam raised a single powerful hand, cutting off their desperate words instantly, his expression completely unyielding. He looked at them with a profound, calm sadness and said, "You did not love me. You loved my shadow, and when the sun went down, you walked away." Liam then turned his gaze toward Lucas, his eyes softening with an immense, overwhelming warmth and a love so deep that tears began to glisten in the old man's eyes. He placed a gentle, heavy hand on Lucas's shoulder and looked at his youngest son, who was standing there in his simple work clothes, completely stunned by the revelation. Liam announced, in a voice filled with profound pride, that he had secretly rewritten his entire will and testament. He revealed that his vast empire, the thousands of acres of fertile land, the massive cattle herds, the historic homestead, and the millions of dollars securely resting in the bank vaults, was not gone. It was completely intact, larger and more prosperous than anyone had ever realized. And every single cent of it, the entirety of the Vance legacy, was being legally, completely, and irrevocably left exclusively to Lucas. Thomas and Eleanor let out sharp, horrified cries of despair, realizing that their naked greed had cost them the very fortune they had worshipped, leaving them entirely disinherited and publicly disgraced. But Lucas didn't look at his father with greed or triumph. He looked at him with tears in his eyes, realizing that his father was safe, that his father was whole, and that the love they shared was the greatest treasure on earth. Liam smiled, a deep, beautiful expression of pure emotional payoff, knowing that justice had been served, his legacy was secure, and that he could finally step into the twilight of his life, knowing with absolute certainty that he was truly and deeply loved. The echoes of Liam's words hung in the grand dining room like a heavy winter fog, freezing the blood in the veins of his two eldest children. Thomas stood paralyzed, his mind, which was usually so sharp with numbers and calculations, completely unable to process the total destruction of his future. The prestigious high society life he had built in New York, the elite clubs he frequented, and the ultimate respect he commanded among his peers were all anchored by the unspoken promise of the massive Vance inheritance. Now, in a single terrifying moment, that anchor had been cut away, and he could feel himself sinking into the abyss of financial ordinary. He looked at the legal documents resting under Samuel's hands, documents that sealed his fate, and a wave of pure, unadulterated panic washed over his face. He stepped forward, his leather shoes clicking loudly on the hardwood floor, his hands trembling as he reached out toward the table. His voice, which had been so cold and arrogant weeks before in the kitchen, was now broken, thin, and desperate. He began to beg, throwing away every ounce of the pride he held so dear. He reminded his father of his childhood, of the long hours he had spent learning the mechanics of the family business, and argued frantically that a single mistake, a single moment of weakness brought on by stress, should not wipe away a lifetime of being the eldest son. He claimed he had only spoken harshly to snap his father out of what he thought was a temporary panic, spinning a web of transparent lies that only made the air in the room feel heavier. Eleanor was in no better state. The polished, elegant socialite from Boston had completely vanished, replaced by a terrified woman clinging to the edge of social ruin. She fell to her knees, her expensive silk dress pooling around her on the floor, her tears smudging her carefully applied makeup. She wept openly, her voice rising in a high-pitched, frantic wail that filled the vast room. She pleaded with her father to remember her mother, asking how he could do this to his only daughter, the one who carried the family name into the cultural circles of New England. She claimed that her husband's medical practice was facing unseen financial strain, and that she had only suggested the public asylum out of a desperate, panicked desire to protect her own children from poverty. She reached out to touch the hem of Liam's immaculate suit trousers, but Liam did not move. He stood like a statue of ancient granite, his face completely devoid of anger, showing only a deep, permanent sorrow. He looked down at his daughter, then across at his son, and the sheer silence of his gaze was more devastating than any physical blow. They were showing their true colors once again, but this time it was not the cold indifference of greed. It was the ugly, groveling desperation of losing power. They were not mourning the loss of their father's trust or the damage done to their family. They were mourning the loss of the money. Lucas stood just a few paces behind his father, his heart hammering against his ribs as he witnessed the surreal scene unfolding before him. He looked at the grand dining room, a room he hadn't stepped into for nearly a decade, and felt a profound sense of vertigo. Just a few hours ago, he had been preparing to go to work at the carpentry shop, mentally calculating how many extra hours he would need to log to buy his father a new, warmer winter coat and pay for the upcoming doctor's appointment. He had been completely prepared to sacrifice his own comfort, his own time, and his own meager savings to ensure the old man had a peaceful, dignified end to his life. Now he was being told that he was the sole heir to one of the largest agricultural and land empires in the state. The sheer scale of the wealth was staggering, but as Lucas looked at his weeping siblings and then at the proud, silent figure of his father, he felt no joy, no sense of triumph, and no greed. Instead, he felt a deep, protective sorrow for the old man. Liam had lived for decades believing his hard work had built a legacy of love, only to discover it had grown a garden of vipers. Lucas stepped forward and gently placed his hand on his father's shoulder, a silent reminder that no matter how much bitterness filled this room, he was still there, unchanged by the revelation. Liam turned his head slightly, acknowledging Lucas's touch with a soft, subtle tightening of his jaw. The presence of his youngest son was the only thing keeping him anchored in this moment of profound family tragedy. He looked back at Thomas and Eleanor, who were still crying out, their excuses becoming more chaotic and nonsensical by the second. Liam raised his hand once more, a simple, elegant gesture that carried the absolute weight of his authority, and the room instantly fell dead silent. He told them that their words were hollow, that their tears were not for him, but for the gold they would never touch. He explained that a father's love cannot be bought, but it can absolutely be forfeited through cruelty and neglect. He stated with absolute finality that the legal documents had already been filed. The deeds had been transferred and the vaults had been locked against them forever. He told them to leave the homestead immediately, to return to their luxury lives in New York and Boston, and to live with the knowledge that when their father needed them most, they had left him to freeze in the dark. Thomas and Eleanor looked up, realizing with a chilling certainty that there was no negotiation, no hidden compromise, and no mercy left to plead for. They slowly stood up, their bodies heavy with the sudden weight of their failure, and walked out of the grand dining room with their heads bowed, leaving the mansion they had once assumed would be theirs. The heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind Thomas and Eleanor, and with that final definitive sound, the oppressive tension that had gripped the room for what felt like an eternity suddenly dissolved. The grand dining room of the Vance estate returned to a profound, almost sacred silence. The roaring fires in the hearths continued to crackle, casting long, warm, golden shadows across the polished oak table, but the atmosphere was completely transformed. The vultures were gone. The deceit had been burnt away in the crucible of truth, leaving behind only the pure, unadulterated reality of what mattered most. Liam stood at the head of the table for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the empty doorway through which his eldest children had just exited. His posture, which had been so rigidly regal and unyielding during the confrontation, slowly softened. The fierce, commanding authority that had masked his vulnerability faded, revealing the profound exhaustion of an old man who had just endured the most emotionally devastating trial of his 78 years on Earth. He let out a long, slow breath, a sigh that carried the weight of a lifetime of labor, of dreams, of heartbreak, and ultimately of a bittersweet victory. Samuel, the old attorney, quietly closed the thick, leather-bound folder on the table. He looked up at Liam with a gaze filled with deep respect, understanding, and a quiet sorrow for the pain his lifelong friend had been forced to bear. With a solemn, supportive nod, Samuel gathered his papers, stood up, and slipped out of the room through a side door, leaving the father and his youngest son entirely alone in the vast historic space. Liam turned slowly to face Lucas. For decades he had looked at this boy through the clouded lens of societal expectations, viewing his simple life, his calloused hands, and his devotion to carpentry as a lack of ambition. He had spent years pushing Lucas away, judging him for not chasing the glittering mirage of power and high society success that had ultimately corrupted Thomas and Eleanor. But now, as he looked at Lucas standing there in his faded work clothes, Liam saw the truth with absolute blinding clarity. He saw a man of true honor, a soul of rare and priceless integrity, and the only child who had inherited the one thing that truly mattered: his heart. Lucas did not look at the grand room with the eyes of a conqueror. He did not rush to the table to look at the deeds or ask about the millions resting in the distant vaults. Instead, his eyes were anchored entirely on his father's face. He saw the tears finally spilling over Liam's weathered cheeks, running down the deep lines etched by age and sorrow. Lucas walked across the room, his step steady and unhurried, and stopped right in front of the old patriarch. Without a word, he reached out and wrapped his strong, protective arms around his father's frail frame, pulling him into a tight, unconditional embrace. Liam buried his face in his son's shoulder, his hands gripping the fabric of Lucas's worn jacket as his body trembled with emotion. The emotional payoff, the absolute release of a soul that had been wandering in a dark desert of doubt, had finally arrived. Liam wept openly, not with the bitter tears of grief for the children he had lost, but with the profound, overwhelming tears of gratitude for the son he had found. In the warmth of Lucas's embrace, the old man realized that his entire life had not been a failure. His legacy was not defined by the thousands of acres of land or the fortunes in the banks. It was defined right here in the fierce, unyielding love of a son who had been willing to sacrifice everything for a bankrupt beggar. When Liam finally stepped back, he wiped his eyes with a trembling hand and looked up at Lucas with a smile of pure, radiant pride. He took Lucas's rough hands into his own and spoke in a voice that was thick with emotion, yet completely clear. He told Lucas that the empire was now his, not as a reward for a transaction, but because he was the only one worthy of stewardship over the land that had taken a lifetime to build. He explained that the carpentry tools Lucas held so dear would now build a future of unimaginable security for generations to come, anchored by the values of humility, hard work, and love. Lucas looked at his father, his own eyes wet with tears, and shook his head gently. He told Liam that he didn't care about the wealth, that he had never wanted the empire, and that the only thing he cared about was ensuring his father knew he was safe, loved, and valued for the man he was, not the money he possessed. Lucas looked around the grand room and then back at his father's face, a gentle smile breaking through his emotion. He told Liam that while the mansion was grand, the fireplace in the small, modest two-room cottage across the state line was already lit, and that a warm, simple meal was waiting for them there. He suggested that they leave the grand estate behind for a while, to let the dust settle and return to the place where they had truly found each other. Liam laughed, a beautiful, clear sound that hadn't echoed through the halls of the homestead in years. He agreed without a moment's hesitation. The old man stepped out of the grand dining room, walking side by side with his youngest son, his arms securely linked with Lucas's strong frame. As they walked out through the front doors of the mansion and stepped into the crisp, clean winter air of Delaware County, Liam looked back at the sprawling estate one last time. The suspense that had suffocated his spirit for months was completely gone, replaced by a deep, permanent sense of peace. He had stripped away his empire to test his blood, and in the darkest hour of that terrifying gamble, he had discovered a treasure far greater than any gold ever pulled from the earth. He was 78 years old, his body was tired, and his days were drawing to a natural close. But as he walked down the driveway toward the future, he knew with absolute, undeniable certainty that he was the richest man alive. He was a father who was truly, unconditionally loved, and his legacy was finally safe in the hands of the son who had loved him when he had absolutely nothing left to give.